In a small, forgotten village nestled between thick, dense woods and an eerie, silent lake, lived a folklorist named Morgan. For years, she had spent her life documenting the haunting tales of olden days. The villagers knew her well, and often invited her to hear their grandmother's whispers about the shadows that lurked in the forest or the spectral lights that danced on the lake's surface. One tale particularly captivated her. It was about an ancient, abandoned house deep within the forest, known as the Fairless Manor. Ah, Fairless Manor. Its very name sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. Legend said that the house was not just haunted but also cursed. Even the bravest hunters and woodcutters never dared venture near it. Why is it cursed? Morgan would often ask the eldest villager, Old Maggie, whose wrinkled eyes had seen much beyond what anyone could imagine. Because some places are born bad. And Fairless Manor. Oh, child, it's the worst of them, Maggie would reply, her voice trembling. Morgan, with her insatiable curiosity and disbelief in the supernatural, decided it was time someone documented the Fairless Manor. Armed with her notebook and a satchel of supplies, she ventured into the forest on a cold autumn morning. The journey was arduous. The trees grew denser as she walked further, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, blocking the sun's light. Finally, after hours of relentless trekking, she stood before the dilapidated structure. Fairless Manor looked as though it had been frozen in time. The once grand mansion now was a crumbling heap of wood and stone. Yet it held an eerie majesty, as if it were waiting for her. Stepping inside, the air grew colder as the door creaked ominously behind her, shutting her off from the outside world. The hallways were lined with dust-covered paintings of people who seemed to stare directly into her soul, their eyes following her every move. The silence was palpable, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing through the empty corridors. What a perfect setting for a ghost story, Morgan thought, smiling to herself. She took out her notebook and began documenting the structure. The grand staircase, the shattered chandelier, the decaying luxurious furniture. It all told a tale of a once opulent life now forgotten. She was so absorbed in her work that she scarcely noticed the descending darkness until it was too late. As night took over, the temperature plummeted. Her breath became visible in the frosty air, and an unsettling feeling began to creep into her bones. She decided to make her way out, but found, to her horror, that the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in, but Morgan calmed herself, convincing her rational mind that old houses often had sticky doors. Walking back into the main hall, she felt a presence. A chill ran down her spine. Turning slowly, she saw faint outlines of figures standing silently at the end of the corridor. Her blood ran cold as she recognized them as the same people from the old paintings. The ethereal forms began to move towards her, their steps unnaturally smooth, floating rather than walking. She backed away in terror, clutching her notebook like a talisman. The figures whispered among themselves, their voices a garbled murmur that sounded like 1,000 overlapping whispers. Desperate, she ran up the grand staircase, past the staring portraits, and into one of the many rooms. Slam! She shut the door behind her, heart pounding like a war drum. Turning, she was met with an even grimmer sight. The room was decorated with antiquated children's toys, rocking horses, ragged dolls, and miniature furniture. Faded wallpaper of playful clowns and animals adorned the walls, but they seemed more menacing in the dark. In the far corner, a child's crib sat shrouded in shadow, gently rocking back and forth as though an invisible hand caressed it. A shiver ran down her spine once more. She approached slowly, drawn by an unseen force, and found a tattered teddy bear inside. Its single remaining eye stared at her with a malevolent gleam. A disembodied giggle broke the silence. Turning around, she saw a vision of a little girl in a white gown standing near the door. Her eyes were hollow black pits, and her smile, oh, that smile, was the stuff of nightmares. She began to sing a chilling lullaby, each word sinking dread deeper into Morgan's heart. As the song crescendoed, the toys came to life, moving and writhing as if possessed. The little girl pointed at Morgan, and suddenly the walls began to close in. Morgan's breath quickened. She knew she was trapped. The curse of Fairless Manor was real, and it had claimed its latest victim. In a desperate attempt, she started chanting every protective spell and prayer she had ever come across in her studies. But the walls continued to tighten. Her vision blurred, giving way to darkness. Morning rays eventually penetrated the forest, shining on the manor's decrepit facade. The villagers noticed that Morgan didn't return and sent a search party. They found her notebook outside the house, filled with meticulous notes, but of her, there was no sign. Fairless Manor had swallowed her whole. To this day, the village warns outsiders of the dangers that lurk in the forest. As for Fairless Manor, it stands still and silent, waiting for the next curious soul to venture into its cursed grasp. Some places are born bad in Fairless Manor. Oh, child, it's the worst of them. On the loneliest stretch of road in North Dakota, where the winds howl and the shadows stretch longer than midnight, there lies an old abandoned house. For decades, it stood as a forgotten relic, a monument to a past buried deep under layers of mystery and sorrow. They say that the house is cursed, that anyone who dares to enter it is doomed to an unspeakable fate. It was on a moonless night that a young couple, David and Sarah, traveling through the area, found themselves lost and desperate for shelter. Their car had broken down several miles back, and the biting cold gnawed at them despite the layers of clothes they wore. "We should try to find shelter," David said, his voice trembling slightly. "We can figure out the rest in the morning." With no other options, they trudged forward, and soon the silhouette of the old house loomed before them like a ghostly guardian. Sarah hesitated, clutching David's arm. "I don't like the look of this place, David," she whispered, her breath misting in the frigid air. "We don't have a choice, Sarah," David replied, pulling her toward the creaking gate. "We'll be all right, just for tonight." The moment they crossed the threshold, an icy shiver ran down their spines. The house seemed to exude an unnatural chill, the air thick with a sense of dread. They pushed the heavy oak door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was a decayed reflection of its former self. Dust-covered furniture, tattered curtains, and a grand chandelier that looked as though it hadn't seen light in centuries greeted them. It was a time capsule of a forgotten era, every corner whispering tales of sorrow and despair. "Let's see if we can find some blankets," David suggested, trying to shake off the unease that gnawed at him. They moved from room to room, each one more unsettling than the last. In one of the bedrooms, they found an old trunk filled with moth-eaten blankets and quilts. They gathered as many as they could carry and made their way back to the main room. As they settled down, a strange scratching sound echoed through the house. Sarah's eyes widened, and she clutched David's hand tightly. "Did you hear that?" David nodded, listening intently. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. He picked up an old candlestick, holding it as a makeshift weapon, and moved toward the source of the noise. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Sarah gasped, her fear palpable. David fumbled with a flashlight from his backpack, its weak beam creating eerie shadows on the decaying wallpaper. "Who's there?" David called out, his voice echoing back at him. "Show yourself." For a moment, the scratching stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that weighed heavily on them. Then, with a bone-chilling creak, one of the walls began to slide open, revealing a hidden passageway. A cold, putrid smell wafted out, turning their stomachs. David turned to Sarah, his face a mask of determination. "Stay here. I'm going to check it out." Sarah shook her head fervently. "No, David. We should leave. Now." But David was already stepping into the darkness of the passageway. The flashlight's beam barely penetrated the inky blackness, revealing narrow, oppressive walls that seemed to close in around him. As he ventured further, the smell grew stronger, almost suffocating. The passageway opened into a small, decrepit room. In the center of the room lay a large, ancient book, its cover bound in cracked leather and adorned with unsettling symbols. Unable to resist, David reached for the book. The moment his fingers touched its surface, a blood-curdling scream filled the air. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "David, help me!" Sarah's voice rang out from the main room, filled with terror. He spun on his heels and raced back, finding Sarah cornered by a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes, looming menacingly over her. David lunged at the figure, swinging the flashlight wildly, but his blows passed through it as if it were made of smoke. The figure laughed, a sound that chilled him to his core. "You should not have come here," it hissed. "Now you cannot leave." Desperate, David grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the door, their only hope of escape. But as they ran, the house seemed to come alive, doors slamming shut, floorboards twisting and turning beneath their feet. They stumbled and fell, the malevolent presence closing in around them. They reached the front door, but it refused to budge, sealed by an unseen force. "You cannot escape your fate," the voice whispered, echoing through the hallways. David and Sarah clung to each other, knowing their doom was inevitable. The shadows encircled them, and the last thing they saw was the glowing red eyes, burning with malice, before darkness consumed them. And so, the house claimed its latest victims. Their car would be found many days later, an empty husk amid the desolate landscape. The house remains, a silent sentinel, waiting patiently for the next souls to wander into its grasp. Locals speak of David and Sarah in hushed tones, adding their names to the long list of those who vanished within the cursed walls. Beware, traveler, for if you find yourself on that lonely road in North Dakota, and the old house beckons you with its eerie stillness, turn away, for once you cross its threshold, you may never return.